It was a case that spanned 2 decades. By the time Peter Tobin was found guilty of murdering teenage hitchhiker Dinah McNichol in 2009, he'd already been in prison for 2 years. He was serving life sentences for the murders of Angelica Kluke and 15-year-old schoolgirl Vicky Hamilton. The 63-year-old serial killer and rapist had buried all 3 girls across a 15-year period, 1 in Scotland and 2 on the south coast of England.
Another awful discovery at 50 Irvine Drive. A body bag thought to contain the remains of Dinah McNichol, brought out from what was the most ordinary of houses. It is no longer.
I think what sets Tobin apart for me is the sheer relentless brutality of him. A man who genuinely paid no attention whatever to anything but his own basest instinct. He did what he wanted, when he wanted, and could get away with it.
Former Detective Superintendent David Swindle from Strathclyde Police first came across Tobin after the body of Angelica Kluke was discovered at St Patrick's Church in Glasgow in 2006. The 23-year-old Polish student had been missing for 5 days.
Coming back to the church today brings it all back to me. The horrors of what must have happened here. Unbelievable. You could never imagine it. A place of worship desecrated by Peter Tobin doing what he did to Angelica Kluke.
But when they arrested Tobin, police were convinced this wasn't his first murder. David set up Operation Anagram, a task force charged with finding out more about the life and crimes of Peter Tobin.
When we looked at his life in Operation Anagram, we found that he frequented places like this: churches, religious establishment, homeless persons, hostels. How many people frequented the places that Tobin frequented? How many people did he meet that were vulnerable at that time, that had no relatives to report them missing? How many of these were missing and were never reported missing that Tobin has killed? We'll never know. Tobin knows the answer.
Throughout his life, Tobin, who was born and brought up a Catholic, had a persistent connection with the Catholic Church, and at various points during his periods on the run or disappearing or adopting false identities, took refuge in Catholic churches and Catholic communities. I think it was simply that was somewhere where he felt comfortable, where he knew how to conduct himself, where he could hide in plain sight. He could conceal his true nature behind the facade of a church handyman or a member of a Christian community. And that was a very safe way to conceal the reality of what he wanted.
To Tobin, nothing was sacred. He took advantage of the open nature of the Currans and the community of St Patrick's.
He was with us maybe about 6, 7 weeks, something like that. And then he started giving Father Jerry a hand in the church, and he was doing bits and pieces. People don't understand you can be with somebody a full day and they never spoke. You know what I mean? People find that hard to understand. There was nothing to sort of, it was a yes and no. That's what it was, a yes and a no.
Peter Tobin was an incredibly manipulative individual. He wasn't particularly emotionally complex himself, but he had a really good understanding of other people's emotions. He knew what other people needed to hear, and he used that to get what he wanted.
Kathy, however, had concern for the ominous stranger who joined their community.
I says to Dennis that there was something far wrong with him. I wasn't too sure what it was, but as far as I could understand, that the jigsaw with Pat McLaughlin wasn't all fitting together. There was something not right there.
But Tobin's next step was more evil than any of them could have predicted. Angelica Kluke was a 23-year-old student from Skotzau near Krakow in Poland who was working as a cleaner in St Patrick's Church. On the 24th of September 2006, she disappeared. Dennis broke the news to his wife.
He said, that girl, Angelica Kluke, we don't know where she is. And I went, what do you mean? He said, she's vanished. All her stuff's there, all her credit cards and everything are all up in their room, but she's vanished.
Police scoured the church and grounds for evidence and began interviewing members of the community. They discovered that the last person seen with Angelica was the church handyman, a man named Pat McLaughlin. Charity worker Dennis provided police with a photograph of McLaughlin.
At 6 o'clock it went in the evening news nationwide, and within minutes their phone line was jammed to say that's not Pat McLaughlin, that's Peter Tobin.
Police now had their main suspect. They quickly discovered that Tobin had a violent past, and the investigation escalated at rapid speed. David Swindle was the lead detective on the case.
I became involved in the investigation when it was established that Peter Tobin, a missing sex offender, had been with Angelica Klook. And soon after my involvement, I arranged for the church to be searched again by specialist officers and specialist teams. There's a garage attached to the church, and that is where Peter Tobin was with Angelica Klook, working on some woodwork. He called her his little apprentice. He actually was interviewed by a police officer when the missing person report was made, and he stayed there for another day, and when the heat was on, he left. When he realised it was being treated as a major investigation, he left. This is someone that was cool and calculated.
Police launched a nationwide search for Peter Tobin.
Mr. Tobin is considered a potential risk to members of the public. Any person who sees this man is advised not to approach him.
It was a name that sounded all too familiar to crime journalist Martin Brunt.
It was a shock to find what had happened, but what made it particularly interesting for crime reporters who were covering the case was that police were appealing for a man called Peter Tobin, and it rang bells. It took me and others back to the days of 1993. They didn't realise that he was, in reality, Peter Tobin with a dreadful history of sex crimes. He was a man hiding in that community under a false name, had duped the church authorities to employ him as a handyman, and of course they were completely innocent of his background.
As the search for Angelica intensified, it became more and more likely she wouldn't be found alive.
We had another search of the church, a really thorough search, because by this time the parameters had changed. There was concern for her safety.
5 days after her disappearance, on the 29th of September 2006, police discovered the body of Angelica Klook under the floorboards of St Patrick's Church. She'd suffered severe head injuries and multiple stab wounds after being attacked in the adjoining garage.
It was in there just after the priest, Father Jerry, left on that Sunday. Within minutes of it, someone across the road had heard a scream. He hit her over the head with a table leg. There was splinters in her head, rendered her unconscious or semi-conscious, bound her hands with cable ties, further assaulted her, dragged her in a polythene sheet into the church here and across the church, and put her body under the floor like a bag of rubbish. She was put under there. He stabbed her, whether that happened underneath there or whether it happened outside, and he raped her. He left her dead.
The British public was shocked to learn the truth of where Angelica's body had been hidden since her violent death.
This should have been a day of worship here at St Patrick's Church, but instead the building remains a crime scene, sealed off and guarded by police. And today brought the news that the people who laid those floral tributes were expecting but dreading that the body found hidden underneath the floorboards here was indeed that of the missing Polish student.
I think the discovery of Angelica's body was awful enough that a young woman had died in those circumstances. The fact that she was buried under a church added some sense of horror and drama to the way people reacted to it. The fact that a suspect was somebody who had been working at the church, somebody who seemingly had volunteered to be a handyman at the church didn't really make sense.
DNA evidence on Angelica's body was confirmed as belonging to Peter Tobin, and his fingerprints were found on the tarpaulin he used to wrap her in.
In forensic pathology, we have what's called Locard's exchange principle. That says that when you interact with another person, you leave something of yourself on them, and you take something of them away with you. Anyone who murders another person, who physically interacts with them, they will leave trace evidence. They will leave DNA, potentially fibres, hairs, all sorts of things.
But Peter Tobin continued to elude the authorities. Despite a nationwide search, he disappeared into thin air.
So things were moving very fast. We have the human remains of a young woman who's been ferociously attacked. Horrible, horrible scene underneath the floorboards. Forensic examination is ongoing. We knew by this time that Peter Tobin had a history of violence, sexual crimes. He had been in prison. He was a dangerous person. Where was he?
David and his team wouldn't have to wait long for an answer. In early October, just over a week since Angelica's murder, they received a crucial breakthrough. Tobin had been spotted, this time using another alias, James Kelly, over 400 miles away.
We got a phone call from the police in London that he had checked into a hospital in a false name. Someone had recognised him. A Metropolitan police officer went in there and confirmed his identity. And I arranged for a team of uniform officers to bring him back to Scotland.
Huntley was born in Grimsby in Lincolnshire on the 31st of January 1974. He had a turbulent time at school and was often the target of bullying.
So I think this created a bit of a sense of shame in Ian Huntley, something that is often at the root of a lot of men like him in terms of what they go on to do. So he started off as somebody who was always the kid that was a bit odd, the odd one out, the one who's a bit of a loner.
In December 1994, Huntley met 18-year-old Claire Evans. They had a whirlwind romance and were married within weeks.
His wife, Claire, quickly found that he had a terrible temper. She later claimed that she feared for her life and that he would often put his hands round her neck.
Ian Huntley is somebody who is not capable of having a normal relationship with a woman, so he moves very quickly because he wants to maintain a sense of control within his relationships. So he will breeze into women's lives this knight in shining armour full of charm and compliments and will kind of try and wind them in.
Huntley's marriage didn't last long. His wife Claire had started a relationship with his younger brother Wayne. Despite the marriage being all but over, Huntley refused to grant her a divorce until 1999 to prevent their relationship from becoming official.
He'd always felt incredibly threatened by his younger brother. He took the attention away from him when he came into that family. And because of Ian Huntley's narcissistic tendencies, he's always going to feel he's being outdone by his brother.
While still married to Claire, Huntley fathered a daughter with a 15-year-old girl in 1998.
I think it would be fair to say that Huntley demonstrated throughout his adolescence and early manhood that he had an unhealthy appetite in younger and younger women.
Well, during his 20s, Ian Huntley preyed on a lot of young girls, underage girls, and the police who investigated the case thought that there were possibly up to 60 young girls that he'd had some kind of interaction with on that level. And he would kind of worm his way into these girls' lives. And they're younger, they're more impressionable, they're easier to lure in.
In 1998, 24-year-old Huntley appeared at Grimsby Crown Court, charged with both burglary and the rape of an 18-year-old girl. Both cases were dropped due to lack of evidence, but he was gaining a bad reputation across Lincolnshire.
He was insignificant little man who, on the surface, wouldn't say boo to a goose. Unfortunately, he had no conscience and would do whatever he wanted when he wanted to do it.
In February 1999, Huntley met 22-year-old Maxine Carr, and after dating for just 4 weeks, they moved in together.
She was naive, impressionable, and he was an interesting figure to her, I think. She found him, perhaps, I would hesitate to call him charismatic, but at least interesting, and did not discover the violent side to his nature that his wife had.
Maxine Carr was a very easy target, in a way, for Ian Huntley, because at this point in his life, he's managed to hone those skills of hooking women in, being quite superficially charming and manipulative, and saying the things that they wanted to hear. So he's got quite a well-rehearsed script at this point in time.
On the 15th of August, 11 days after the girls went missing, Sky News decided to retrace their steps, which meant interviewing the last person to see them, local school caretaker Ian Huntley, the boyfriend of Holly and Jessica's classroom assistant, Maxine Carr.
It's 6:15 p.m. The timeline on that Sunday night, the 4th of August, puts the girls here, right in the forecourt of the village college, the local education centre. We know they'd been to the sports centre just across the road a few minutes before to buy some sweets and were carrying on walking through what would have been very familiar territory. Their primary school, St Andrews, is just across the back of the village college here. How do we know they were here at 6:15? Well, we have an eyewitness. Ian Huntley here is a familiar figure. Evening, Ian. You're the school caretaker. The girls, Jessica and Holly, would know you, and they saw you on the front doorstep. What went on?
I don't know the girls. I stood on the front doorstep grooming my dog down. She'd run away and come back a bit of a mess. They just came across and asked how Miss Carr was, as she used to teach them at St Andrews. I just said she weren't very good, as she hadn't got the job. And they just says, please tell her that we're very sorry. And off they walked in the direction of the library over there.
And you may, as it turned out, have been the last person to actually chat to them before they vanished.
Yeah, that's what it seems like.
Huntley looked like an unassuming, ordinary little bloke with a soft voice who wouldn't hurt a fly.
He was a slight withdrawn sort of character, but at the time he seemed reasonably credible. It seemed like a credible story. That's where the girls would have walked. So when I talked to him, I had an open mind. I certainly at the time wasn't thinking, this is the guy that's done them harm.
Maxine Carr was also keen to appear on camera.
We interviewed her in the middle of the village and got her to tell us about her relationship with the girls.
They're ever so funny, they're brilliant, they're kind to everybody. They wouldn't say a bad word about anybody. And they love their families and everything, which is why nobody believes that they would ever run away. They was very close to all their family. This is something I'll probably keep for the rest of my life, I think. It's what Holly gave me on the last day of term. She was very upset, and that's the kind of girl she was. She was just lovely, really lovely.
In the conversation, we realised a few minutes afterwards, she spoke about the girls in the past tense. When I was talking to her live, didn't really occur to me, but a couple of minutes afterwards we said thanks very much and she walked off, and my producer said, just play that tape again. I'm sure she was talking about the girls in the past tense.
Often the perpetrator is among the searchers, not without exception, but often because they want to admire their own handiwork.
Could it be the person responsible for Holly and Jessica's disappearance had been under the noses of detectives from day one? On the 16th of August 2002, 12 days after the disappearance of 10-year-old schoolgirls Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman, local caretaker Ian Huntley and his girlfriend Maxine Carr had been taken in for questioning by police. Interviews given by the pair on Sky News had roused the suspicions of detectives.
We were starting to think, wow, these two people really could be involved in something to do with these girls. They're close enough to it. They've clearly aroused police suspicion at this stage.
But after just 7 hours, they were released when Carr provided Huntley with an alibi. She claims she was with him in their home on the night of the girls' disappearance.
It wasn't until about 10 or 11 at night that we heard that police had released them, which we found interesting. And I got a phone number from Maxine Carr. I thought, well, worth a gamble, I'll just ring and see if I get through to them. And extraordinarily enough, I did. I got straight through to Maxine Carr. And I said, I gather you've been interviewed by the police. What happened? How are you? She said, well, we're fine. I can't tell you anything about it, but it's all right. Huntley then grabbed the phone off her and I guess wanted to end the conversation quickly. So he said, well, thanks for ringing. Yeah, we're fine. Nothing to report. The police have let us go. Nothing going on. Thanks a lot. Thanks for ringing. Bye.
Once Huntley and Carr had been questioned, further searches were carried out at their home and at Huntley's place of work, Soham Village College.
It was quite clear as we checked back that something had happened on the Friday night during the interviews with Huntley and Carr. It had triggered further searches, and because they suddenly saw Huntley as perhaps the key figure here, they went back over his territory, his home, and his workplace. And it was then that they began to find evidence that he had abducted the girls.
On the 17th of August, investigators got their biggest breakthrough in the case yet. In the bins at the school where Huntley worked, they found the burnt remains of 2 football shirts, tracksuit bottoms, shoes, and some underwear. Forensic expert Peter Lamb identified the clothes as those belonging to Holly and Jessica.
One of the crucial items in this particular case was the tops that the little girls were last seen in. These were unusual, and this helped us tremendously to build up a picture of the types of fibres that it would be easy for us to find.
Whenever 2 human beings interact, there is an exchange of material, be that something as tiny as DNA, up to something less subtle like a fibre, up to saliva or bodily fluids, blood. We leave a mark on each other, and no matter how hard one tries to destroy all of that evidence, there will usually be something left to say that 2 people have been interacting. There is this constant interaction of material that allows forensic scientists to draw conclusions and ultimately to come up with very strong evidence that places one person in one place with another person and builds the case.
Forensic scientist Peter Lamb had the girls' clothes, but now he had to link them forensically to Ian Huntley. And it didn't take long.
During the examination of the items from the bin, I found 5 human head hairs. These head hairs were compared with Holly's hair and Jessica's hair. They didn't match either of those 2, but they did match Ian Huntley's hair.
This vital evidence led to the arrest of both Ian Huntley and Maxine Carr on the very same day, the 17th of August, on suspicion of abduction and murder. Levi Bellfield was born into a Romany gypsy family in Isleworth, West London, on the 17th of May 1968. He was one of 5 children. Aged 10, Bellfield lost his father to leukemia, and as a result, he formed a very close bond with his mother.
Bellfield was very much a mother's boy, much beloved of his mother. It was a close-knit family, brought up in West London, in what was effectively once a huge community of travellers, and was groomed to thinking from the very early days that he was very special, that there was something particular about him. His mother encouraged him in that view.
I think during his childhood he was a bit of a tearaway. He was a young lad who wanted to do what he wanted to do and not much stood in his way. So he was often kind of larking around and getting into a bit of trouble at school, but nothing completely out of the ordinary.
By the time Bellfield was 13, he'd had his first brush with the law and was arrested for burglary in 1981. It would not be the last time he was in trouble with the police.
I believe Bellfield occupied what you might describe as the halo of Levi Bellfield. I am greater than anything. He was above the law, above suspicion, operated entirely under his own steam, in his own way, at his own time.
In 1989, 21-year-old Bellfield set up home with a girlfriend. They went on to have 4 children together.
He could literally charm the birds off the trees. This is a 19.5, 20-stone man with a huge neck, almost occupying his entire shoulders. He wasn't an attractive man, but my goodness me, he had the gift of the gab, and he didn't half use it to his advantage, particularly when it came to girls.
On March the 21st, 2002, 13-year-old schoolgirl Amanda Dowler, known affectionately as Millie, went missing from her home. Journalist Martin Brunt remembers that day very well.
She was on her way home. She got off the train, was going to walk the half-mile or so back to her home. She was in her school uniform, very identifiable. This was daylight, busy time of the afternoon, lots of people around, but nobody saw anything.
Millie had phoned her father to say she was heading home, but never arrived.
She seemed to have disappeared into thin air. There was CCTV footage of her getting off the train at Walton Station. Some very blurred images of cars and the odd person in the street where she was headed home, but nothing more than that. And it became clear very early on that police were really struggling to find what had happened to her.
The last sighting of Millie Dowler was on Station Avenue in Walton, just 50 yards from the home of Levi Bellfield.
The search has taken in stretches of water, including the River Mole, but police have been concentrating on ground near the busy station and interviewing commuters.
We have nothing that gives us any positive indication that she's gone off of her own volition. Equally, we have no positive information that she has been taken off the street and abducted. At this time, all of our lines of inquiry are open.
On September the 18th, 2002, 6 months after her disappearance, the body of Millie Dowler was found by a group of foragers amongst the trees of Yateley Heath Wood in Hampshire.
So Millie was identified through dental records. She was known to be missing. Dental records were obtained, and then they were compared to the remains that were present, and sadly for her family, it confirmed that that's who it was.
It was clear to forensic ecologist Professor Patricia Wiltshire that Millie's body had been in the woods ever since she disappeared.
I was able to tell the police how long each bone had been there and how long ago it had been moved, because the bones were moved around by animals, you see. There was no doubt in my mind, really, that she had been there since the early spring.
How Millie was killed remained a mystery.
The degree of change that the body goes through after death, particularly in the sort of timescales we're talking about with Millie Dowler, really hinders what the pathologist can see, what the pathologist can say. It doesn't mean that there's nothing we can see or say, but clearly the less we have to work with, the more difficult it is.
One likes to be objective, one likes not to think of the remains as a person, one likes to just look for the evidence and you try to be objective. And then, of course, they take you into a scenario where you become fairly emotional. Well, you can't help it. It's an emotional sort of scenario. And then it comes a bit of a shock, really.
The police had no suspects and no forensic evidence. And just 5 months after the discovery of Millie Dowler's body, only a few miles from Walton-on-Thames, another young woman was murdered. At around midnight on the 3rd of February 2003 in Kingston, London, 19-year-old Marcia MacDonald caught the bus home after a night out at the cinema with friends. It was the last time they would ever see her. Walking home, Marcia was attacked from behind less than 100 yards from her parents' front door. Colin Sutton was one of the lead detectives with the Metropolitan Police at the time.
Well, Marcia was found on the street where she lived, 10 or 15 doors down from her parents' house. Local resident heard a noise, heard a whimpering, if you like, and called police, and she was found there with this terrible head wound, and she was taken to hospital and died 2 or 3 days afterwards. Marcia was killed with a single blow to the back of the head with a heavy implement.
Forensic evidence suggested the weapon used was most likely a hammer.
Hammers are effective striking tools, so it's no great surprise that you can cause very severe damage to a human skull with relatively little effort with an effective hammer. You will often see lacerations, they're often curved to match the profile of the hammer, and you'll often see skull fractures. They're quite often depressed, so pushed inwards towards the brain, because the hammer is exerting its force so focally.
Nightfall and detectives in Hampton still work on, but though they've searched tirelessly all day, they remain baffled as to who carried out this apparently random attack.
Often these things happen and are carried out by somebody the victim knows. In this case, I'm sure police looked at boyfriends, family members, but very quickly ruled out any kind of suspect like that. So it soon became obvious that this was a stranger murder, and those are very rare. So very soon, very quickly after Marcia's murder, people in the area became very concerned that there was a killer on the loose.
Subsequent investigations led police to a mentally unstable 16-year-old who wasn't competent enough to be charged or even interrogated about the incident.
And as a result, he was sectioned and was put into to some sort of institution compulsorily. And although he hadn't been charged with the offence, everybody kind of thought, well, it was him, and so we can put that offence to bed and you know, we've solved that, if you like.
But then investigators noticed a possible link to similar attacks that had happened in the area in the months before.
There was another 16-year-old schoolgirl that she was thought at first to have slipped over in the snow and banged her head. And it was only then when Marcia was murdered that police looked at this occurrence some 2 months previously and realised that that could have been an assault as well. And they went back to this girl who'd been treated in hospital and were able to talk to the hospital staff and look at the description of her wounds and some photographs and conclude that the likelihood was that she too had been attacked but had survived. We found a couple of other offences as well. Again, young ladies had been attacked in the street and hit over the back of the head, and in both these cases they'd survived.
However, none of these other victims were able to identify the attacker.
They just, said I was walking along, and the next thing I knew, I woke up in hospital some hours or some days later. So we didn't have any kind of clue or sighting that led us towards the suspect for it, because they just simply couldn't remember it.
All of the attacks seemed to be totally unprovoked. Could they all have been committed by the same perpetrator, the man who murdered Marcia McDonnell? By joining the dots, Colin and his team could link Bellfield to another vehicle, the car that ran Kate Sheedy down.
And one of the times that he was arrested was in May 2004, when he was arrested for kidnap, which was kidnapping the landlord of a pub near where he lived in West Drayton. And nothing happened about it, and the landlord in the end said, oh no, it was just a prank that went wrong, don't worry about it. Didn't want to press charges, no charges were brought. But the crucial thing was that that arrest took place, and that abduction took place indeed, in a vehicle, and that vehicle was a white Toyota Previa. Kate Sheedy had been attacked in Isleworth, not by being hit across the head, but by being run over by a large vehicle. And she said that this vehicle was something like a Ford Galaxy. Of course, that's exactly what a Toyota Previa is.
The White People Carrier. That was actually on my drive about 2 weeks before he
ran Kate Sheedy over with it, only because he asked me if he could leave it there for a couple of nights, and I begrudgingly said yes.
And he got somebody to go and do a check on the number plate of the Previa that Levi had been arrested in, and I remember her saying to me, "Governor, I think we might have hit the jackpot," and said it was white. We now had somebody, Levi Bellfield, who had the right kind of white van that was used at the time Amelie Delagrange was murdered, and the right type of vehicle at the time that Kate Sheedy was run over.
Bellfield was now the prime suspect. At dawn on the 22nd of November 2004, police raided his West Drayton home.
In the attic is a naked Levi Bellfield. He'd covered himself up in the hope that no one would find him. Well, they did.